This is an oral history with Rhonda Duchin, conducted by May Sebel on Monday, June 15th, 2020. Good morning, Rhonda. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, May.
Good, good. So, Rhonda, let's go back and talk about your family history as far back as you know anything about it.
Well, I was so fortunate. I grew up with not only my grandparents, but great grandparents on my maternal side. So they weren't born here. My great grandparents came to Dallas, couldn't tell you when, but in the 50s from Kansas City. But originally, my great grandmother was from Poland and my great grandfather was from Russia, and they met in Kansas City when she was only like 14 years old and he was 24. And he was swept away by her, and they were married quickly. And so they had three children, and all three lived here. Two have since passed away, but I do have a great uncle who lives here in Dallas, and so I have a lot of family here. Um, and my grandmother passed away in 2018, I believe, at the age of 106 and a half.
Oh my goodness.
So,
Fantastic. What kind of stories did they tell you when you were growing up?
um, it's interesting. I remember as a child, and I was 18 when my great grandmother passed away. And unfortunately, I was around, but I never really sat to listen to the stories. It was really more from my grandmother telling the stories of her parents. But as a child, I like to play poker and games, cards, everything. Um, and people would say, "Oh, you get that from your dad." It was like when I was 5 years old, I used to sit on my great grandmother's lap drinking her coffee as she was playing poker with her friends. So that I remember very vividly. She lived in the apartments over off of Edgemere. If people from Dallas, they know the red apartments. Again, I would spend a lot of time over there. She could bake like no one could. And one of the best stories, and I believe it to be true, and I tell friends all the time, my great grandfather, for their 60th or one of their late anniversaries, had bought cemetery plots for their anniversary. And so, and they had that thick, Russian and Yiddish accent. And my great grandfather, his name was Abe, and hers was Fanny. And so the following year, my great grandmother Fanny asks Abe, she says, "No, Abe, what did you get me for our anniversary?" And he slams his hand down and he says, "Why should I get you anything? You didn't use what I got you last year." So, he was a very quiet person. Now, in hindsight, it was like, why didn't I sit there and really talk and get to really know them and where they came from and what they did? The story of my great grandfather was in Russia. He pretended to be his older brother because his older brother was already married and had kids. And he wasn't married, and he pretended to be the older brother because the older brother was drafted, had to go into the army. And so he didn't want his older brother to do that. So he pretended to be him, but then defected. And his goal was to go to California, I guess maybe to mine gold, who knows? Never made it that far. He ended up, like I said, he went, I think, through Philadelphia and then ended up in Kansas City. And again, that's where he met.
Were there relatives in Kansas City that he went to
Yes.
join?
Well, for him, I'm trying to think how he got there. Honestly, I don't know. But for my great grandmother, her mother, and well, I'll tell you a story about how the whole lineage of her family has now come about. But her she had an uncle or relative in Kansas City, and her mother had passed away at an early age. Her father remarried, and supposedly the woman he remarried was not nice. And again, stories that I heard that my great grandmother was a very rambunctious and, kind of a tomboyish kind of girl, and, I guess hard to deal with, whatever. Anyway, I guess the uncle in Kansas City sponsored her, so she came to live with him, but she was also treated like a maid, and so she wasn't happy there. And the story goes that the uncle said she was 18 so that she could get married, and I believe she was like 15 when she got married. So, because she wanted out, she just didn't want to be there. So there are tons of relatives, because my mom and my grandmother remember, my mom grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and, her friends were her relatives. So it was a very close-knit thing. Fast forward to today, or a couple of years ago, we have connected with a cousin who is a relative, like my great-grandmother's father and his great-grandfather were twin brothers back in Poland. And this relative, who now lives in Israel, has put together like over 2,000 names of relatives from that family, from that side.
That's great. That's great. So were you born in Kansas City?
No, I was born here in Dallas. My mom, I guess, moved here. I know things went back and forth. Like I said, my great-grandparents moved here. I think they had friends. My great-grandfather was a tailor, and I think through friends or whatever, they opened up a tailor shop. And so I think that's how they got here. I know that we have a picture of a storefront that he had. And my mom came here, excuse me, and that's where she met my dad, who was from LA, was from California. And so that's how, my more immediate family started. And then my grandmother also moved here from Springfield, Missouri, and prior to that, Kansas, and then moved to Dallas and lived here since the 50s.
Mm-hmm. What was your maiden name?
Koff, C-O-F-F.
Koff. Okay. And do you have a Jewish name?
Rivka Miriam.
Rivka Miriam. Okay. What is your earliest childhood memory?
My earliest is we grew up on Marsh Lane. I grew up on Marsh Lane, and I remember sitting, well, I do remember my sister, supposedly I thought I was in the car, but I've been told I wasn't in the car. But again, living on Marsh Lane, it was a busy 6-lane, major street. My sister had gotten into the car. We had a circular drive, and I guess put it in reverse, without the car being on, and the car started rolling back onto Marsh, craziness. And she, thank God, it must not, who knows what day it was, the week it was, but, she was fine. Everyone was fine. I, from my recollection, I thought I was in the car, but nobody.
But you remember the story.
I remember the story. Yeah. And then also I remember there was a little girl who lived across the street. We were on a corner, so I can't remember. I want to say it was Cromwell and Marsh. And we had a maid growing up, and I would ask my maid every day. I asked Margie, I said, can I go visit her? And I would go there. I cannot tell you how many times. I never met the girl once. Either she was doing something, she was sleeping. I mean, I was no more than 4 or 5 years old at the time, because when we moved, I never met her. So I don't know if she was sick or something, or, later on I thought, well, maybe they knew we were Jewish or something. I don't know. But
what was your favorite thing to do for fun when you were growing up?
I, I remember being in that house on Marsh Lane. I remember, I don't know, I felt I was a very quiet and shy child. Um, the first time I really had close friends was when I moved to the house in North Dallas on Stephanie, where I went to Preston Hollow and a lot of, eventually that turned in, all the kids that went there went to Hillcrest, so also known as Hillcrest High. Excuse me. And my very best friend, who I am still friends with today, we moved to Stephanie, the street Stephanie, and she lived 2 doors down, and we met. She was playing in her back driveway, and I was riding my bike back and forth, and I did it like 20 times or whatever. And finally, it was like we met, and to this day, we are still the best of friends. And so, really, I mean, our lives revolved around each other until we went off to college. So
That's great.
yeah.
Did you have pets? Did you have any pets growing up?
I did. We for a few times my dad would bring home a dog or something, and I don't know what happened. Maybe it was too difficult to take care of, and we ended up finally with a poodle named Buffy. And of course, I grew up watching the Family Affair. So then we got a second dog, and we named him Jody. No, not Jody. Buffy and Sissy. That was the older sister's name. My cousin ended up getting a dog, and she named him Jody. Anyway, but Buffy, yeah, they were awesome dogs. We had gone to Israel as a family in 73, and the dogs went to stayed over, were boarded. And when the saddest thing was when we came back, Sissy we'd only had her for about a year or something, died.
Oh,
While there, and they said she had an enlarged heart and stuff. So
that was sad.
I was very sad.
So what was your religious life growing up? What congregation did you belong to? And how did your family celebrate the holidays?
My parents got married at Sheriff. And so up until, that was in 1955. So they were there up until 71. My grandfather had passed away, and my grandmother was a member at Tiferet. And so I would go to services with her while she was, her year of mourning.
Mm-hmm.
And I particularly didn't care that much for Sheriff. And so I ended up, both my siblings were older. They ended up, I know my sister was confirmed at Sheriff. I don't remember about my brother, but I'm 3.5 and 5 years younger than them. And so it was kind of like we led 2 separate lives. And so I said I wanted to go to Tiferet. And so we ended up, my parents said, okay, they moved. My parents weren't particularly religious or observant. We did always big Hanukkah celebrations with lots of gifts and with family. Excuse me. And then Passover was with my mom's sister. We always had a big family Passover meal. And of course, going to service, we would go to services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I went to Sunday school, Hebrew school all of my life. At that time, I had some really good friends. I got very involved young with NCSY, that was at Tiferet, and that was my entree into, Jewish, my Jewish culture, my Jewish life. And so I loved it. I went into every convention imaginable. And then I ended up also going into BBYO. And I just remember someone at that point, like, you can't do both. And, obviously you can, but I said, okay. So I ended up really directing my attention to BBYO and got very, very involved that way. But a lot of it was mostly cultural, up until probably, I don't even remember when, but I didn't even know about the holiday of Shavuot, because by that time, when you were there for school, Shavuot usually happened after school ended. And so I never knew about anything, and it wasn't really taught. I went to Sunday school, not in the Hebrew school, not to really learn anything, but just to be with my friends.
Okay.
Because none of them went to school where I went. And so it was nice to, have that group of friends.
Mm-hmm. What world events had the most impact on you when you were growing up? And did any of them personally affect your family?
Good question. I look back going, I was oblivious to the world. I think to some degree I led pretty much a sheltered life. I will say that now, my mom was very worried when they were talking about desegregation and about busing. And my mom was very concerned about me in particular. Again, I don't remember whether there was concern more for my siblings. They were, I guess, already in high school. But she had me tested to go to like Green Hill or Hockaday. And both of them were like, one of them said no, they didn't want to accept me. The other one said I'd have to go to summer school. And I'm like, I'm not going to summer school. And so my mom was just really worried that I would be bused into a Black neighborhood. Interesting, all with everything that's going on today. And she was just so afraid for me. And the funniest thing was, again, like I said, I grew up with a maid, and she was truly like a second mom to me. I mean, she taught me so much. I just loved her. And her husband was very involved, and they were family. We would go visit them. I knew all about her family. And his name was Henry, and he told him, Shirley, I will take care of Rhonda. And, I just remember being tested. I don't remember being afraid. The only thing I do remember was there was no busing. They did to the Black community, but they did bus in from the Black community at Franklin Junior High. And so I remember people talking about, being afraid of going into the bathroom, they're going to ask for your lunch money or whatever. And it just didn't really, I never felt threatened in any shape, form, or fashion. I remember I had a PE teacher who was also the drill team coach, and we just knew she was definitely afraid. I mean, because she would do stuff and it'd be like, have girls on the drill team that didn't belong, but because they were Black, she was like, I'm gonna include them. And it was like, but they can't. It's like, it wasn't their thing, whatever. And so for high school, I had the choice. I applied to go to Skyline, which at that time was kind of our first magnet school here in Dallas. And, I used to tout, it is 51% Black, and I love going there. So early on, diversity was very important to me. So
you ended up going to Skyline.
I did. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was a perfect choice. And so I didn't go to Hillcrest. I had the choice of going part-time, of going to 2 schools, and Hillcrest being my home school. But I said, no. I had 2 best friends, Janie Schultz, who many of the community know, the Schultz family, and my best friend that 2 doors down, Robin. They were both a year older than me, and they were like, one went to Hillcrest, one went to Skyline, and they were both pulling at me. And they were, and so when I went and saw Skyline, I'm like, hands down, this place wins. It was just a really awesome experience, and really learned a lot there.
So the events of today must really be affecting you, since growing up, you were very much into diversity and didn't have the fears that your family had.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And again, I honestly believe it was having Margie a part of my life because, it was, probably looking back at it, having a maid and whatever, but yeah, it's what's going on in today's world. I, I, I'm struggling with how to be effective,
Mhm.
and help move the needle. So it's, it definitely wears on me.
I can understand that. Let's see. Were there any famous or infamous relatives in your family?
Well, I don't know if they're related. My grandfather's last name was Einhorn. And I did hear about there was an Ira Einhorn who I think was like a serial killer or something and did really awful things. That would be being that that's an aristocratic name and was never changed. I'm sure there's some way, and I don't know if anyone in my family who has done his lineage. But like I said, he came, his father came from Austria, and so it would be quite interesting to see if he's any part of our lives. But we all have history. Now, on my great grandmother's side, the Hammer family, that this new relative that we found, he's not new, has done all of this research, and I did find out I'm directly related to Marley Matlin. I believe her mother is a Hammer, so we're directly related. But other than that, I haven't found anyone who I would claim, or if they would claim me.
Are there any special heirlooms that have been passed down to you from your family?
There are. My great grandmother, through my grandmother, I received her candlesticks. So supposedly those came from Poland. I don't know, but I'll keep that as my own history. And so my family knows they're very special. And then I'm going to show, this is a necklace, a pendant that has my name and birth date on the back. My grandmother had a bracelet and a different charm for each of the grandchildren. And she wore it for many years. And I guess at one point she decided she was going to break it up. And so each of us got our little charm.
Nice.
And I had seen everyone's, and I'm like, hey guys, mine's the prettiest. Because the boys were the same, and I believe they were given to the wives after they got married. But there was 4 girls, all ours were different, and I truly believe mine was the prettiest.
Okay. You were married?
I'm married.
Yeah. How did you meet your husband?
So we met at the University of Texas in Austin. It's interesting. I had, I was part of that big group, it's like just moved down 35. And I was, like I said, I was very involved in youth group and BBYO. And by the time I got to UT, it was like, I felt like even though UT was humongous, it felt like it was the same thing, the same people, and I struggled with it. And after my sophomore year, I had a friend who went to San Diego State, and we were talking, and she says, well, come here. And I'm like, I really wanted to go to Israel. I wanted to do like a year course or something in Israel at that time, but I had an aunt, my grandfather's sister had never married, and she left a very small inheritance for education. And I told my parents, I said, I want to use it. And, I said, I want to go to Israel. They're like, no, you can't go to Israel. And I said, okay, then I want to go to San Diego. And so I ended up going to San Diego State for a year. And the funny thing was, halfway through the year, I was like, I'm homesick. I want to go back home. And so it turned out that I transferred back to UT, and that August or whatever, the week or so before school started, that's where I met David, my husband, who was visiting a mutual friend, and like, hey, come over and visit. And I had heard of him. I knew of him. I had friends who were in a sorority, so names were very familiar to me. And I'm like, oh, I've heard his name. I don't really know him. And then the very next day, he's like, well, I'm coming back over for swimming. And I'm like, okay. And, we went swimming, and then we had our first date September 10th, and 35 years later.
Where was he from?
He's from San Antonio.
Oh, okay. All right. That's very, very nice. What memory stands out most from your wedding day?
Well, I remember somebody telling me, take a step back and take it all in. Don't just run through the whole thing. And I tell, when people get married or whatever, I'm like, that's my one piece of advice I tell everyone. It's like, just take that moment to step back and really experience it. For whatever reason, I remember silly things like the waiter spilled soup on me, on my dress. I just remember having a great time. I remember being scared, obviously. I was very scared. And so we were young. And of course, at that time, I felt like I was old, but very young. I was 24, and David was 25. And I was like, I look back now going, oh my God, we were young. We were silly. I remember it being in June, and it was like, we were fortunate. It was only like in the high 80s. It's like, oh, great weather. It was great weather. And the funny thing was, afterwards we had a limo take us around, and then really right back to the hotel where we had our reception. And that morning in the elevator, we run into all of David's relatives. It's like, oh, good morning.
Were you in the business world or professional world?
I ended up, after college, my family had a family business in the schmata business. My dad was a manufacturer's rep for children's clothing, and my brother joined him, and then and then they split, and then my sister joined my brother. So it was kind of two side by side. They weren't in competition or anything, but traveled a lot together, did a lot of traveling. Had a showroom at that time, the Apparel Mart, which is, that got closed down, and they ended up moving to the World Trade Center, now Dallas Market Center. And when I graduated college, I do remember, not being able to go to my college graduation because market was going on in Lubbock, and my mom said, well, we could really use your help there. So instead of going to my graduation, I was working. And so I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I've kind of been like that my whole life. It's like, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. But I did apply for a job, and it was I worked in retail all of my life. In high school, I worked at Casual Corner, a children's store and stuff. And just, doing the thing that kids do, get a part-time job. And so I thought I would go into retail, and I ended up getting a job at a men's store called Mark Shale. And I thought, oh, and at the time, I think it was an $18,000 salary. I think there was possible commissions. I don't even remember. And when my, mom and dad were like, we really could use you. And I said no and went to work for my family, and did that for about 12 years. And
so you went to all the markets?
I went to all the markets. I traveled. I did a lot of traveling with my brother, but we had regional markets. We went to Houston, Lubbock, Oklahoma City, and then eventually I ended up going to New Orleans and Lafayette, Louisiana and stuff. And I went a couple times to New York. And of course, I feel like Dallas is this big, metropolitan city. The first time I went to New York, I was like, I felt like such a country bumpkin. Like, oh my God, walking down the streets of New York City, and my brother walks very fast and I'm like trying to keep up with him. And there's a guy, it was raining, who had a trench coat on. Don't know if there was anything underneath, and yelling at the top of his lungs, excuse my French, I'm not even gonna say the word. He goes, F the Russians, F the Russians. And my brother's like, just keep walking, Rhonda, just keep walking. Okay.
Of all the things you've learned from your parents, what do you feel was the most valuable thing they taught you?
The best is two things that my mom always said. This too shall pass, and babies bring their own luck.
Oh. That's nice.
Yeah.
Good words of advice. What is one thing you most want people to remember about you?
Very giving, very forgiving, family.
That's nice. Have you been involved in the Jewish community here with organizations?
I have. I'm a life member of Hadassah, a life member of National Council of Jewish Women. I couldn't think of it for a second. I'll be a board member now of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. I was involved early on with Federation, Younger Set. Very, very involved with the communities of, we were at one time members of Anshe Torah, and I was very involved there. And then we are now members of Beth Torah and very involved there. So, yeah.
Very nice. Is there anything you would like to add?
No, I'm proud to be a Dallasite and appreciate all that the Dallas Jewish Historical Society does. The interesting thing is how I actually asked to be on the board because I ended up doing, at Beth Torah, we have Karen Lehner Mitzvah Day, and it's, one of the things was to do stuff at Dallas Jewish Historical Society. And for many years, while my grandmother lived at Golden Acres, I always went there. So it gave me an opportunity to see her. And then after she passed, I was like, well, I want to do something different. And so when this came up, I just loved, I worked on one of the projects that's an ongoing one right now where they're, a husband and wife, when he was in the war, shared, wrote letters, and it seemed like almost every day, and they were all kept. And so the preservation of those and the opportunity to have read them, as I was helping to, make sure they were all being put in, the papers that needed to be, I was like, oh my God, this is just one of the coolest things that this organization does, and the preservation of our history. And I'm sorry that people don't write letters anymore, because that is going to be so lost on the generations to come. So
that's true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rhonda. It's been a pleasure to hear your story.
Oh, thank you, May. I appreciate it.
Okay. Right.